So welcome to Learning and Memory. The reason why learning and memory is very important to buyer behavior is because we imitate what we see. We use the same brands our parents did, we imitate our friends, and that becomes part of our learning process. It's something we develop as we go along. And the reason memory is important is because if I'm a marketer, I want to get my brand in your memory. I want you to remember it, and I want you to think about it when you're out buying, or at least have it come across your mind. So what marketers can do around learning and memory is they can understand how do we learn, and how do we remember, and what do we choose to remember. And by understanding that, they can design their marketing and their advertising to take advantage of the way we naturally learn. So that's what we're going to look at this week. And I want you to remember, as buyers, we're not logical. We're not logical buyers. We're emotional, we're sensory-based, and social. And those are the things that drive us for the most part. But learning and memory are very core in this. There are brands that I still use today that I use because my mother used them. And I'm sure it's the same for you as well. Marketers today have it much harder than they did in the 1950s and 60s. In the 1950s, product was at the core foundation of the way we marketed, right? We marketed the product and didn't worry so much about the customer need. And today, we have to be very concerned about the customer, very concerned about their experience. Why? Well, because they're probably going to write a review and recommendation. And as we know, or will know when we cover that in a couple of weeks, that is a critical component to a change in the way buyer behavior is evolving. So now the customer experience is very important, and understanding the consumer and how they buy and why they buy is critical. So knowing why that person buys validates and directs their decisions can make our marketing superior to somebody else's. And marketing never had the big role that it does now. I mean, it has a huge role now because of the social influence. So there are things that influence us, and there are three major ones. The first is the external, which covers our culture, the groups of people or packs that we hang out with, and the situation. You know, a prom promotes a different type of buy than going to a Patriots game. The internal, which is our perception. But I also think bias falls into this area. Attitude, knowledge, personality, lifestyle, roles, and involvement. And then the last, of course, is marketing. And that's the product itself, how we're going to promote it, the pricing structure, the distribution channels, where we're going to put it and place it, and then the service. And then the marketer can put all of this together in the way that they advertise or they go to market. So where does learning fall in this? Some people think it falls into the external, and some people think it falls into the internal, because there are two camps of learning, and we're going to talk about those. But this is an important aspect to understand, because we don't have it easy as marketers anymore. As marketers, we have to understand how the person buys. So consider the fatal flaw of Ron Johnson, who was hired to be the CEO of Penny's, J.C. Penney. So he came in and he believed that buyers buy logically. Why? Well, because he bought logically. He was a logical buyer, and he came from Apple, and he loved the Apple model. And he thought this would be cool, right? We're going to change the way the J.C. Penney consumer buys. We're going to make it a logical purchase, and we're going to tell them that the price is the price, and there's no more cutting of coupons and weekly specials and all the things that they had become accustomed to. But he really didn't do any research into his consumers, into the buying behavior of the people his company was selling to. And so when he changed it, they lost a ton of business, and consumers hated it. Why? Because the people who went to J.C. Penney, the target audience of J.C. Penney, they liked the feeling that they were getting a deal. And since they no longer felt they were getting a deal, they left J.C. Penney by the Groves, and they're still recovering from that. So even big companies need to understand their consumers. They need to understand how they buy and how they think and what works for them. Ron Johnson didn't understand that, and he treated his entire customer base the way he buys, and that's just not a really good idea. So what you see here is the iconic ice cream truck. And when I was a kid, this was part of my learning process, and I'm sure it was part of some of the people who are listening today. What would happen is the ice cream truck would go around to neighborhoods and it would sell ice cream, right out that window. And it had an iconic song that it played, whatever it was, all around the mulberry bush. Every one of these trucks had a slightly different song. But you could hear it a street over, so you knew it was coming to your street, and it gave you time to upturn the cushions and the couch and grab whatever loose change had fallen out of your dad's pockets and, scurry through your bank to get your 25 cents to go out and buy the Rocket or, the Fenway Slammer or whatever ice cream came to mind. And most of these ice creams were second-rate at best, but they were colorful and they were interesting, and we ran and flocked there all summer long. Now, ice cream truck companies decided, this is such a cool thing and people love it so much, we're going to offer it in the grocery stores in the off-season when people can't get to us because we can't get around the roads of New England. On the surface, it sounded like a pretty good idea, right? People love the iconic ice creams from the ice cream truck, the Monster, the Slammer, the Rocket. We're going to offer it in the grocery stores, and people are going to love it. But it didn't sell. And the reason it didn't sell is because it wasn't just the ice cream, because trust me, they weren't the top line ice cream. It was the experience of the ice cream truck. It was the sound of the ice cream truck, and all of us standing in a circle at the ice cream truck and listening to what everybody else purchased and thinking, oh, I want that. Oh, I want that, right? This went on all summer long, but it didn't hold the same appeal when you walked into the grocery store and you just saw the ice cream sitting in the bin. It had to have this associated story that went with it in order to make it really important and valuable. Now, on a funny note, my sister had a dog named Jack, and they used to always buy him a Frosty Paw at the ice cream truck when her kids were little. So she would give her kids the $1 and then 50 cents for the ice cream for Jack. And they found that Jack could actually hear the song long before it hit the neighborhood. So he would already be out standing and barking and running in circles. And so her kids throughout the entire summer got to be the first people in line for the ice cream truck because Jack was so far ahead of everybody else. So that's my fun story about the ice cream truck. But this was part of my youth. It was very memorable. It wasn't just the ice cream. It was the entire experience. And that, my friends, is what gets it into your learning and your memory. Drive-in movie theaters were another one of these experience-type situations when I was younger. We went to the drive-in movie, but it really wasn't to see the movie because none of us ever lasted that long. It was more to play on the swings and to have the experience because, let's face it, they were dust bowls that were mosquito-infested with hard-to-hear, crackly speakers, and the only thing that was a redeeming quality was the fact that they had swings and they had a great concession stand that our parents always let us get something from. The interesting part of this story is back in the 1950s and 60s when I was young, the movie theaters would insert pictures of popcorn and Coca-Cola into the movie. It was a form of what they call subliminal advertising. It was a fast flicker of the images right before the concession stand would open at intermission, and it was not perceivable by the naked eye, but it was perceivable by your subconscious. The belief was that, like brainwashing, it had the capability of getting you to impulse buy and get up and get a Coke or a popcorn, at intermission. Now, whether it worked or not isn't the point. There's a lot of research on both sides saying it didn't work and some research saying it did. But the federal government made a decision during the Cold War to eliminate all forms of subliminal advertising here in the United States. So today, it is illegal. All of us have products that we remember our mother or our father or maybe an older brother or sibling using, but for me, it was Contadina canned tomato paste. My mother is half Italian, and she used to cook every Sunday. And when she cooked, she drilled into our heads as kids, my sister and I, that Contadina was the only really good tasting tomato paste. She wouldn't use anything else. And I find myself today, really, without thinking about it, always just buying contadina. I mean, Hunt's and the store brand could be a lot less, but I still pay a little bit more and get the contadina. This is all part of nostalgia and learning and memory. The second story I want to tell you is about Father John's medicine. Now, my parents were not wealthy people. We were definitely in the lower end of middle class, but we had everything we needed. But for medicine, my parents believed in Father John's medicine. Now, Father John's medicine was one step up from carnival medicine. All you were missing was the carnival barker going, step right up, for $1, get your medicine. It came in the brown bottle that you see, and it didn't have any ingredients listed on it. You had no idea what you were getting. And I remember saying to my mother, why in God's name would you feed us that horrible stuff when we were kids? And she goes, look, you're all healthy. So it was doing something right. In her mind, and this is the important part of learning and memory as well, in her mind, spending the money to get us Father John's medicine was like giving us a Mercedes. You know, to her, this was being a good parent. This was being a good parent. I think the result of these horrible tasting, grayish looking medicines that were served in the 50s and 60s was that the parents, the people like us, when we grew up, the children we grew up, we went in the complete opposite direction. And we bought the really sweet, sickly sweet cherry, grape, watermelon type syrups because we had been force fed the Father John's when we were younger. So sometimes learning has the positive effect of a product. It's a product like contadina where I want to buy that product because I loved my mother's cooking. And sometimes it has the opposite effect where you say, I would never buy that. My father bought it, my mother bought it, and it was just crappy product. Whichever the case is, you want to obviously, as a marketer, be in the contadina side and not in the Father John's medicine. By the way, Father John's medicine was made on the banks of the Merrimack River in Lowell, Massachusetts. I want to talk to you about STP, segmentation, targeting, and positioning, a key component for marketers and something you probably learned about in your marketing principles class, but I want to revise it here and use the pet rock as an example of a case study that really did a nice job with segmentation, targeting, and positioning. So the pet rock was nothing more than what you see. It was a rock that you could get pretty much on any beach, and it had a little nest, and it had a little manual on how to take care of it, and a walking string so you could walk it around the neighborhood. And it came in this really smart packaging that looked like it was for something that had to breathe. And Gary Dahl, who is the inventor of the pet rock, did an amazing job with segmentation, targeting, and positioning. His segments, anybody you could sell to, would be, you know, in his mind, the parents, specifically mother and father, the child, the grandparents, grandmother, grandfather, and then the siblings, of course, if they were a little bit older, and then maybe other parents who would bring something to a party. It cost $3.99 for this back in the 1960s. My sister had one, and this is exactly what it looked like. So when he looked at his segments, he decided that grandfathers and fathers were probably not good choices, and $3.99 was considered to be a little bit of money, maybe even for siblings. So he focused instead on two major targets. Now, those are who he's going to select to go after. The mothers, who he felt bought most of the child's gifts for parties and for the child. And then, in addition to that, the child itself, because you have to get them to be interested in and want the product. So he had two different positioning messages. To the mothers, his positioning message was, look, it's no mess, it engages your child's imagination, and it doesn't die. Because mothers had a tendency to, be the people who were responsible for the pet long after a child lost interest, or, that mouse had lived longer than it should have. And the mother was also the one who usually flushed the goldfish down the toilet or buried the mice in the backyard. So he felt this was a really good positioning message to use with the mothers. And then with the child, he said it's going to be a loyal pet. You can take it anywhere. Everybody in your neighborhood's going to have one. Don't wait. Get yours now. So he had really good positioning messages. And by the way, He just passed away recently, but he was a multimillionaire as a result of the pet rock. So how you target and then position your messaging, how you segment, target, and position your messaging is really important. And when we look now at how you remember things and how you learn things, I think you'll be able to take segmentation, targeting, and positioning into account. So oftentimes we will buy what our parents used, or we'll go in the complete opposite direction and not buy what our parents used. We will buy to nostalgia. You know, we will sometimes see something. In my case, it might be, you know, penny candy or something I see from my youth. One day I bought a hula hoop because it reminded me of my youth, and my daughter and I hula hooped. You can also do the anti-buy, like the Father John's medicine, where you buy in the opposite direction, or your parents bought cheap cars, so you will never want to go down that path. And we're influenced definitely by the experiences and the products of our youth. Whether we like it or not, those are already embedded in our memory and will pop up periodically. Sometimes the songs or a word or something will remind us of a product that we used or bought in our youth. And then scents are also tied to memory and emotion. You know, there are scents that you smell and all of a sudden it brings you back to your grandmother's kitchen. So these things are important because once they're in there, they're hard to get out. And for the people who sell products like Father John's medicine, if they happen to have a bad reputation from a younger day, they need to overcome that bias in perception. So you need to understand how it embedded itself in somebody's memory and what people actually think of a product. Research is a good way to do that. It's a really good way, but your sales will also tell you a lot, your target audience. So we need to take all of these things into consideration when we look back. Now we're going to look at how we learn and how we keep memory. There are two camps or types of learning. The first camp is the behavioral and the second is the cognitive. So you're either a behavioralist or a cognitivist. Now, behavioralists believe that the majority of the way we interact with the world is through stimulus. Some stimulus outside of us prompts us to do something. And cognitivists believe that we take it in, you know, we use our mental capabilities. It's an internal process, and then we respond. If you believe, for example, that if you're a behavioralist, then you will think coupons and discounts will work because it's an external stimulus, and once somebody sees it, they respond. If, on the other hand, you believe that doesn't always work, then maybe you're a cognitivist. So let's take a look at some of the theorists who theorize both behavioral and cognitive and see which one you think you are. So the first major player in the behavioralist or behaviorism side is Pavlov. His theories around you ring the bell, you get the dog to salivate even before you put the food there are well known, and I don't need to rehash that, but his point is that we respond to the stimulus. We don't necessarily have to respond to the food. We can respond to the stimulus. So similar to we don't have to respond to the product, we can respond to the coupon. So the stimulus creates the response. And what he found with the dogs and what marketers are finding is that it has to be close in time and space. So the coupon has to be close enough to when you're ready to buy. There has to be repetition. If you don't have a repetitive nature to the marketing, then people are going to forget it. And you have to use some type of a vehicle to get that information to the folks. The second theorist of the behavioralist side is B.F. Skinner. He was known for teaching pigeons how to play ping pong, and he did this through behavior modification by small steps of changing and directing and guiding the behavior. If you're a behavioralist as a marketer, then you would believe that we can guide and change and modify the behavior of the customers we have by creating an outside stimulus that drives them in the direction we want. If you're in agreement with this, loyalty plans are part of what you think works, right? Not only the coupons, but the loyalty plans, because the loyalty plans are designed to change your behavior. They're designed to get you to buy when you're not ready to. They're designed to get you to buy what they want you to buy. And so they're like a reward and a reinforcement for doing business with various companies. On a fun note, I actually got to meet B.F. Skinner a couple of years ago when I was, well, he's passed now, but I got to meet him when I was in college. They had a lottery system, and I ended up winning the lottery, and I got to take a class with him in a cross-cultural program with Harvard. And I was one of like 400 people. It was really exciting, and he walked on the stage the first day of class and introduced himself, and the place erupted, and I was thinking, oh, wow, I am so fortunate. I'm going to be taught by B.F. Skinner. And then I never saw him again. He had a teaching assistant come and teach all the remainder of the classes until the very last class, and then he stepped back on and, said, it's been a pleasure having you, which was kind of interesting since I thought I was going to be taught by B.F. Skinner. But anyway, he was a behavioralist, and he took Pavlov's concepts of, stimulus and response to a new level by saying not only is it stimulus and response, but we can actually modify or change or drive the behavior in specific directions by using the right step-by-step process of the stimulus. From the cognitivists, those are people who believe that learning is an internal process. We take it in, we process it, and that's really the key. It has nothing to do with modifying behavior or Pavlov and his dogs. That's more for dogs, not for humans. And they're not a supporter of Gestalt either, because they don't feel that there's that combination. They honestly believe that learning is an internal process, something that we do inside of ourselves, and then we respond. So Gestalt is the next learning theory that we want to look at, and he bridges the gap between behavioralist and cognitivist. He basically says, yes, there is an external stimuli. I mean, that's part of our senses. But then we take it in and cognitively make sense of it and interpret it, and then we respond to it. So he's sort of in the middle. He's not a behavioralist, but he's also not a cognitivist. He believes in the combination of the two skill sets. So if you take a look at the image, this is a Gestalt style of image. You can see that your eye is drawn to two different parts of this. First the outer part and then the inner part. So his attitude is we look at this image, we look at these optical illusion images, we look at what's around us, and we make sense of it, we interpret it. But we don't do that externally like Pavlov's dogs. We do it internally. We think about it. There's a process that we go through. We don't just respond like the dogs do. Now, there are three ways that we can learn. The first is direct. That means that we actually have the experience. The second is indirect. That means that we actually witness the experience somebody else is happening. And the third is unintended. And unintended is when we learn something, but it wasn't what we intended to learn. It's something completely different than what we intended to learn. And I'll give you an example of direct learning. So when we were kids, everybody and their brother stayed outside all day long, right? No, everybody stayed outside. And in the summertime, bees were pretty prevalent when I was a kid. And there was a nest that had harnessed itself in the ground for yellow jackets, which are very aggressive bees. And we were playing outside like a cowboys and Indians type thing, and we tied one of the kids to the chair, and the chair fell over and landed on the top of the nest, and the bees came out, and the person got 125 bee stings. It was actually me that ended up getting 125 bee stings. And so that was direct learning for me, but it was also indirect learning for the kids who were surrounding me at the same time. And then there's the unintended learning that happened from that. So what ended up happening is somebody saw the event happening, got the hose and hosed everybody off, and ended up having an unintended learning experience about how to handle bees. So sometimes you learn directly, sometimes you learn indirectly, and sometimes you learn but it's unintentional. And how you're going to learn, how you learn makes a difference, because behavioralists will say that direct learning is great, but indirect learning can also be used, whereas cognitives feel it's more the direct learning that's much more valuable and more important than the indirect and the unintended. So now we've looked at learning, and you have some decisions to make, whether you're a cognitivist or behavioralist or you're Gestalt, who sits in the middle. But now what's more important, or just as important, is how do we get people to remember us? How do we get them to remember our brand, our product? Well, first and foremost, You can only remember 3 to 4 pieces at a time in short-term memory. So when you design your ads, you have to make sure you design your ads around this piece of information. Don't put more than 3 to 4 key points in your advertising, and you're really better off putting less than 3 to 4. If you put 5 or 6 things that your product can do, it's not going to be remembered. People aren't going to remember it. And ads do best when they're designed to take advantage of this type of information. Second, it takes us 7 times to see an advertisement before we remember it, even funny ads, especially funny ads. In funny ads, we might remember the funniness of the ad, but by the time we see it 7 times, we'll finally remember who it is that was the advertiser. We don't oftentimes remember who the advertiser was or all of the details about an ad until we've seen it at least 7 times. This is why repetition is important. There's explicit and implicit conscious and unconscious memory, and memory decay is immediate. Within 24 hours, you will only retain 50% of what you saw and 50% of what you heard. So if you go to a class, for example, and you listen to a lecture, you'll only remember 50% of it. It's one of the reasons why I do a slide deck in addition to doing the notes, because it helps to reinforce the information. Repetition leads to retention, so this is why you see advertisements all the time that are repeated again and again and again. So 1, only 3 to 4 pieces at a time in your advertising, because we can't remember more than that in our short-term memory. 2, 7 times to just remember all of the key factors. And 3, decay is immediate, within 50% within 24 hours, so repetition leads to retention, and it has to be in proximity. You can't show one ad 1 month and another ad a month later, because we won't remember it. Remember, we lose 50% of what we hear in 24 hours. And I do this exercise in class all the time. I put up a sheet and I show words, and then I take it away after 2 minutes and I ask people to remember as many as they can, and every single time they get to pretty much the same number, and then they forget. And then if I ask them the next day, 24 hours from when I last asked them, they will remember even less. So memory is important, and you need to structure your advertising and your campaigns and your branding around it. So what can we do in our advertising to enhance or help our memory? Well, first, if the original circumstances that created the memory are recreated, then it makes it better. This is why advertisers advertise in the same programs again and again and again. Because we're more likely, if we see it, let's say, on American Idol the first night, and we see it on American Idol the second night, we're more likely to remember it. Repetition, but not all at once. It has to be repeated over time, and it has to be still within a certain amount of distance between them, because remember, we forget. Visual beats verbal. We're changing as a society. We're much more visual than we ever were. And visual is very, very important. Context is important. And of course, anytime we can associate our product with something, it makes it better. So for example, cruise ships, if you think about Carnival, they're the fun ships, right? If you think about Nike, they're for athletes. This helps. It helps anytime you can create an association, because people may not always remember everything about the ad, but they will remember the association. So how can we understand brand memory a little bit better? Well, one is the universal set of memory. That's every brand that you can think of that possibly does a particular product. So let's say, for example, we're talking about TVs. Maybe I can name 10 different TV companies and you can name 5, but that is my universal set. That's everybody who does TVs. The retrieval set are the first 1 or 2 that come to mind, and they're the ones that are most likely to get your business. You want to be in that retrieval set as much as possible. And then the evoke set is a little bit beyond the 1 or 2. It might be 3 or 4. So there might be 10 brands, 4 that are part of my evoke set. The bottom 2 not being the ones I ideally would buy, and then the first 1 or 2 that I would buy. Being in the evoke set and being in the retrieval set are key. So that is how memory works. The words that we use to describe our brands are very important. When you think just do it, if I say just do it to most of you, you're going to know who that is. some brands do a really good job of keeping consistency across the brand, and so we know who they are and what they do. What about nostalgia? Well, certainly nostalgia plays a huge role, right? Penny candy was big when I was a kid. When I was in Canada about 5 years ago, I went into a store. It was like a country store, and they had these rows and rows and rows of penny candy that I hadn't seen in years, you know, waxed lips and candy necklaces and things that really brought me back to my youth. And I bought a bunch and brought it home to my kids. I'm sure they didn't see quite the appeal in it that I did, because it was more, you know, from my youth. But nostalgia can play a role. And if you start to watch some of the advertisements that are out there, there is definitely nostalgia in them, especially if the target audience are people who are, like, say, in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, where they can use images from the youth of those generations to drive behavior. I saw one recently that was a Pepsi commercial, and it showed a woman who was dressed like a hippie, and she had a can of Pepsi in her hand, and she was dancing, and she had flowers across her hair and a typical hippie dress and long hair. And then there's a cut scene, and it cuts to when she's like in her 70s, and the guy says, you know, Pepsi was the drink of your mother when she was young, and now it's the drink of your mother when she's older, is the implication. And that's a nostalgic commercial for people who maybe drank Pepsi when they were hippies. So nostalgia can play a role, and words are very important in consistency. So there are two more concepts that I want to cover as part of this deck, although they stand a little outside. And the first is halo effect. The second is genericizing. When it comes to halo effect, marketers can use this because in our memory we get set up that somebody is good or a product is good, and we naturally extend that out to other aspects of that person's life and to other products within the product line. So, for example, we think of Tom Brady and Peyton Manning as competitors, and if you're in New England, you probably love Tom Brady, and if he stands for a product, which he rarely does, but if he decides that he's going to endorse or stand for a product, then you're going to believe the best of that product because you believe the best of him. Now, if you're from outside of New England and you don't think of him quite as the GOAT that we think of him here in New England, then maybe it's the opposite direction, right? You don't particularly like the product that he supports. The same can be said for Peyton Manning. You know, Peyton Manning was a Papa John's sponsor, or he was a car company sponsor. Because he was a great athlete, you may think the halo effect that he would also be only repping great products. This also extends to products that use the same packaging. Have you ever gone into a store and you look at the Old Spice body wash, and right next to it is the Rite Aid brand of body wash, and they look exactly the same. They use the same packaging style, they use the same packaging color. The point isn't to get people to make the mistake and buy the Rite Aid thinking they're buying Old Spice, although I'm sure that happens. The point here is to get people to think, well, if the packaging is the same and the box is the same and the product smells very similar, then it must work the same. This is also part of halo effect. Genericizing, on the other hand, is when a brand becomes so iconic in its space that we no longer call it by that name separately. We call everything in that space by that name. So Kleenex is a good example of that. Kleenex is now a genericized word. Just because we say the word Kleenex doesn't mean we're going to buy Kleenex. It could mean we're going to buy any other brand of tissues. It could be Scott's brand of tissue or Puffs or whatever. So that's what we call genericizing. Plenty of products have this issue besides Kleenex. These are things that I just wanted you to be aware of. They will be on the exam, so I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of the difference between the halo effect and genericizing.